My middle child is named Susan. The oldest girl in the story of the Chronicles of Narnia is also named Susan. This week, I was reflecting on that character, and I remembered a saying that we had in our house when my Susan was in high school. Susan is always right. Why did we say that? What does that have to do with Susan in the Chronicles of Narnia? And why should you care? If you stay tuned, I'll tell you. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome, especially to my patrons and channel members. This week, I was reflecting on Susan Pevensie in the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. In the last book, The Last Battle, the other three children, Peter, Edmund, and Lucy, go to Narnia for the last time, this time for good. They remain there. But Susan is not with them. Susan is not with them because she no longer believes in Narnia. Susan realizes that it was all a game that they played. It was their imaginations, dreaming up wild adventures for themselves. I read the Chronicles of Narnia as a believer, and at the end I felt terrible for Susan. I was so sorry that she was lost and would not join her siblings in the wondrous land that they had discovered as children. Susan Pevensie was one of the few fictional characters for whom I felt deep empathy. I think some of that empathy came from my feelings about my own child by the same name. My child was raised in the faith I had as I was raising her. As a teenager, she expressed interest in becoming a missionary doctor. I was thrilled. I could think of no greater calling. But as Susan went through medical school, she talked less and less about her faith. I would ask her about what church she was attending. Sometimes she would tell me about her church, but sometimes she would just say that she was between churches. I suspected that her faith was waning, and I feared that she would become like Susan in the Chronicles of Narnia and end up lost, unable to enter the magical land of heaven that is the promise of Christianity. What I should have reflected on is that Susan is always right. You see, in our house, we came to that understanding when Susan was in high school. Susan to this day is the smartest person that I know, although she will vehemently deny this, as she knows many other people that she says are smarter than her. The first sign of just how smart Susan is occurred when she was just 4. We were at the dinner table, and I wanted to go to Dairy Queen for dessert, but I didn't want to say it out loud in case my husband didn't feel like going. My oldest was 6 at this point and was learning to read. I was afraid that if I spelled it, my 6-year-old might figure it out. But because she was just learning, I knew that if I said it fast enough, she would not. So I asked, "Would you like to go to Dairyqueen?" Susan turned to her older sister and said, "We're going to Dairy Queen." I was flabbergasted. I asked her, a child who could not yet read more than a few words, how she figured this out. She said, "You said Q. Not very many words have a Q, so I thought, what starts with Q? Queen. There was something in front of the Q, so I thought something queen, Dairy Queen." Yes, that is how her little 4-year-old mind worked. And by the time she got to high school, we had come to realize that not only was Susan smart and confident, part of her confidence came from the fact that she didn't say something unless she knew what she was talking about. So when Susan said something, Susan was always right. There were many times that Susan said something that I questioned, but when I looked it up, I found out that Susan was right. Other people came to this conclusion as well. When Susan was in high school, she did a paper for English class on the Krebs cycle. I read that paper. It was way over my head. I had no idea what she was talking about. Her English teacher didn't either. The English teacher had to take it to the biology teacher and ask, "Is this right?" "Yep," the biology teacher replied. "That's right." But in the area of religion, I thought Susan was wrong. I should have known. Susan is always right. I'm not saying that Susan is an unbeliever. I actually don't know what Susan believes right now, as she doesn't talk about it much, which makes perfect sense. If she doesn't know for sure, she doesn't say it. Is there a God? I don't know. There could be. I will say with confidence that the Christian God isn't real. I don't believe that any gods are real, but I won't say that no gods are possible. I will also assert that the gods of human religions are made up by humans, just as Aslan and Narnia were made up by C.S. Lewis. We all know that Narnia is just made up. It's fiction. The book series is classified as fantasy. Obviously, it's supposed to be fantasy as allegory for reality. But in reality, it's fantasy as allegory for another fantasy. There are even a couple of spots where the story admits this, but nowhere is it clearer than in the character of Susan. And like my Susan, who is always right, Susan Pevensie is also always right. We learn why Susan is not with the others as they enter Narnia for the final time in the last battle at the end of chapter 12, through the stable door, where Lewis writes, "Sir," said Tyrion, when he had greeted all of these, "if I have read the Chronicles aright, there should be another. Has not your Majesty two sisters? Where is Queen Susan?" "My sister," answered Peter shortly and gravely, "is no longer a friend of Narnia." "Yes," said Eustace, "and whenever you've tried to get her to come to talk about Narnia or do anything about Narnia, she says what wonderful memories you have. Fancy you still thinking about all those funny games we used to play when we were children." "Oh, Susan," said Jill. "She's interested in nothing nowadays except nylons and lipsticks and invitations. She always was a jolly sight too keen on being grown up." "Grown up, indeed," said the Lady Polly. "I wish she would grow up. She wasted all her school time wanting to be the age she is now, and she'll waste all the rest of her life trying to stay that age. Her whole idea is to race on to the silliest time in one's life as quick as she can, and then stop there as long as she can." "Well, don't let's talk about that now," said Peter. "Look, here are lovely fruit trees. Let us taste them." And then, for the first time, Tyrion looked about him and realized just how very queer this adventure was. And that's it. We never hear about Susan again. The way I remembered the story, when they came to the very end, Lucy felt sad that her sister was not with them. But when I reread the story in preparing the script, I discovered that that was not in the story. That was my projecting my own longing for Susan to be there when I was a believer onto Lucy. Tyrion is right to look about and realize just how queer this adventure is. How is it that we have all of Susan's friends and family here? As the group moves further in, they find their parents and all of their close friends that died in prior books are all there, yet not one of them expresses any feelings about Susan. They rejoice at reunions and feel happy at being together again, but shed not a tear at not having their beloved sister, Susan the Gentle, with them. They don't say that they expect to see her one day, which they clearly do not expect, as she is not able to come to this place, as only believers can come, and Susan no longer believes. This creates the first problem, the problem of who is going to heaven, to Narnia, and who is not. Susan was not an evil character. She was Susan the Gentle. She was neither selfish nor unkind. She didn't betray anyone like her brother Edmund did. She did nothing that she needed forgiveness for. Thus, her inability to come to the magic land Narnia isn't because of her sin or that her evil would taint the land. It's simply that she doesn't believe it is real. On one level, this makes sense. Why would anyone try to go to a fictional place? I wouldn't buy a ticket to Atlantis. It would be a waste of money. But what doesn't make sense is an unbeliever not being permitted to enter. Unable to find the place as she isn't looking for it makes sense, but unable does not. How did the others arrive there? It is revealed later that they are all dead. They died in a train wreck. What did they do at their deaths to enter this land? Nothing. They just magically appear because they believe. Thus, the way into Narnia is not an effort of the believer looking for the place. It simply happens because one believes. Thus, one who doesn't believe does not fail to see Narnia, even though they are really there. This negates the theory that is put out to us in chapter 13, how the dwarves refuse to be taken in, as it claims that the unbelievers really are there. In this chapter, the dwarves are with the others, but they cannot see, nor do any of their other senses work correctly, and they think that they are in a stable and do not believe when the others tell them otherwise. Most telling is Aslan appears and then tells Lucy, I will show you both, Lucy and Eustace, what I can and cannot do. So we have the all-powerful God figure, unable to reveal himself to the dwarves. Aslan conjures a feast for the dwarves, who eat it, but taste only hay and dirty water. Aslan laments that the dwarves cannot be taken further into Narnia because they refuse to be taken in by what they perceive as a lie. But is this the fault of the dwarves? If all of their senses are telling them one thing, even if it is wrong, the solution isn't to conjure things for them to sense, but to figure out why their senses aren't working correctly and fix them. Instead, they give up on the dwarves and leave them there. This, Lewis explains, is his view of hell. It's not a place of external torment, but of being so convinced that you are in a place of torment that your mind conjures up the expected torment. One experiences it even though it is not there, and they cannot be rescued as they are trapped in a cage of their own making. What does this say about the divine hiddenness and the omnipotence of God? Why is Aslan unable to fix the dwarf's sensory anomalies? Why is Aslan unable to reveal himself? Most importantly, is it the fault of the dwarves that Aslan is so lacking in power and ability? Lewis has inadvertently revealed the greatest flaw of the Christian faith, that the Christian God blames his creation for his own flaws. He blames those that he created for being unable to do what not only he did not make them able to do, but he himself also is unable to do. If God himself cannot reveal himself to a man in a way that all mankind can know and understand, then mankind is no more responsible for unbelief than the dwarves are for being unable to see Aslan, who is equally incapable of revealing himself. Thus, we end up in the story much like we do in discussions with Christian apologists on Christianity. The rules about who goes to heaven and hell, what they are, why they exist, and are all inconsistent and vary from one Christian believer to another. But in all of them, God is either unable or unwilling to save the unsaved, and the believer is in the unenviable position of trying to explain why. Next, we find that Lewis actually admits that it never really was real. In chapter 15, further up and further in, Peter asks, How can this be? For Aslan told us older ones that we should never return to Narnia, and here we are. Yes, said Eustace, and we saw it all destroyed and the sun put out. And it's all so different, said Lucy. The eagle is right, said Lord Diggory. Listen, Peter. When Aslan said that you could never go back to Narnia, he meant the Narnia that you were thinking of. But that was not the real Narnia. That had a beginning and an end. It was only a shadow or a copy of the real Narnia, which has always been here and always will be here, just as our own world, England and all, is only a shadow or copy of something in Aslan's real world. And of course, it is different as a real thing is from a shadow, or waking life from a dream. The good professor has just told us that Narnia, the Narnia that the children went to, was not the real Narnia. It was a shadow, but he goes on to say that a shadow is not a real thing. So why are they critical of Susan for saying that Narnia was never real? It wasn't, as the professor here has just admitted. He tells Peter, Edmund, and Lucy here that the Narnia they experienced as children was never real. It was like a dream. In other words, when Susan said that Narnia was just a game they played as children, Susan was right. It was never real. Susan just figured it out sooner and didn't have to come back to the professor to learn this, as she already knew. So why now, as they enter the real Narnia for the first time, are they critical of Susan for coming to this understanding far sooner than they did? And why would Susan be unable to enter this Narnia just because she was able to figure out that the other Narnia that she entered as a child was never real? It seems like the point of the story is that the reward of heaven is only for the gullible. Susan, who understood the truth that the magical land of Narnia she traveled to as a child wasn't real, is barred from entering the real Narnia unless she is able to regain that childlike faith and is able to proclaim what we have been just told by the professor was never real is in fact real. In other words, she must deny what she knows to be true and proclaim a fantasy to be true before she can enter a different world that is in fact real. One must embrace a lie to enter. The others, that were not as smart as Susan, all still thought the fantasy was real. So they all enter the reality of a deeper fantasy only to discover that the original Narnia that they thought was reality was in fact a fantasy. When they come to understand that Susan was right all along, they get to enter Narnia, but Susan does not. What kind of God would make this the way one is supposed to live life? Finally, we turn to how Susan is the only one that actually follows what Aslan directed. I found this Tumblr post, which I found very insightful. The one I wanted to throttle was Polly. Lucy is possibly young enough not to really get it yet, but Polly was a grown-ass woman and should have known better than to talk that kind of shit about a young woman wanting to stop being a child. Susan wanted to grow up. She wanted, as mentioned in The Horse and His Boy, to fall in love, to get married. She worried, she protected, she mothered. She was the only one out of all of them who got it right. Aslan told them that they had to move on, to grow up, to find him in their own world. Susan was Aslan's big success. The others couldn't do it. They couldn't take the lessons that they learned in Narnia into their own world. They couldn't make a difference there. No, they all spent their time obsessing with getting back. Narnia was heaven for them, and they couldn't function anywhere else. So Aslan took them back one last time to suspend them forever in the only world they wanted. Narnia was not Susan's heaven. Narnia was not what Susan wanted. Eternal youth and innocence is not what Susan wanted. Susan wanted to grow. Susan wanted to grow up. Susan wanted love and family and her own world. Susan's heaven was the one drawn from earth, from a life lived to the full. Since I was a kid, I have always thought of the last battle as a very sad story, because it is ultimately a story of failure. All the kings and queens of Narnia die and are brought back to the dying magical world because they couldn't accept what Aslan had told them over and over about growing up and moving on. They weren't supposed to come back. It was a final act of mercy that Aslan allowed them to do so, since they couldn't bear to live in their own world. I think Susan would visit them someday, with her queen's crown and her blazing red lipstick and the lines of growth and character on her face, and very gently explain to the perpetual children in Narnia that she was thankful that Aslan hadn't taken her with the others, that she was thankful for her children and grandchildren, for boyfriends and husbands, for a life that was full and happy and productive, that she never needed Narnia to be happy, that she missed them, that she mourned for them, but she wouldn't change her own choice for anything. Thus we see that when Susan said Narnia was a child's game, it wasn't real. Susan was right. When Susan did not return to Narnia with the others at the end, it was through no failure on her part, nor was it because she was evil or unworthy of the glorious fantasy. Rather, she was the one that did as Aslan directed. She grew up, She moved on and she lived her life. She didn't need a fantasy world. The real one was for her. The others all died in a tragic accident, never having achieved anything of value in the real world. Instead, they wasted what little time they had, chasing what even Lewis admits was never real. Thus, my takeaway from the Chronicles of Narnia is what I learned from my own Susan. Susan is always right. Live your life.